It's very peculiar that we're starting this class. This is the 25th year, and like Tom said, we'll never forget this class. This is absolutely one of the strangest things to do. But tonight, I got to tell you, with Linda Sickafoose, she owned her own nursery, and she has as much knowledge as anybody I know, and she gets more out of her garden than anybody I've ever known. And then she's going to talk about the vegetables. In the second half, you get to hear Stephanie talk, and she's going to talk about the perennials and annuals. This gives you a good start, and for those that you want to sign up, you can talk to Tom again, and next year you can actually get into the Master Gardening class. I do appreciate everybody taking their time tonight to see the webinar, and I think it's a lot of useful information. And I know Linda sort of had to alter the way she does hers a little bit, and I know Stephanie altered hers a lot. But anyway, here's Linda, Tom.
Okay.
Well, thank you very much. My name is Linda Sickafoose, and I'm a former greenhouse owner, and more importantly, I'm a lifelong gardener. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yeah, make sure everyone's got their microphone muted. I think they can.
Okay. So most of you are here because you want to learn how to garden, and maybe some of you are here because you're socially isolating and you're bored. Either way, that's all good. One of the great things about gardening is that there's always something new to learn, and gardeners always learn from each other. One of the reasons that I garden is because for me, it's always a way to get away from everyday life and the stress of life. And gardening is cheaper than therapy, and you get tomatoes. Now, interestingly enough, today I looked on the CDC website, and gardening remains an activity that we can still participate. It's considered an essential activity, and that means that the gardening stores that you're used to going to and that supply gardening products will probably be open. They may have, you know, some new types of restrictions like staying 6 feet away from each other, but I think it's something that everyone can easily do. And we should try and support our local garden centers if we can. Now, there are a lot of great reasons to garden. And one of the first things I ever hear when people say they want to garden is that they're doing it because they want to save money. And while you can save money while gardening, and you can get fabulous produce while gardening, I urge everyone to remember that gardening is kind of a long-term process, and that it usually takes a garden a certain level of maturity before it really starts to pay off. If you're starting a brand new garden in your first year and you're starting an in-ground garden, the first year it'll probably return about 74 cents per square foot, which that's not too shabby. But you can't really take into consideration your time or labor into that equation, but that's okay because gardening's good for you and it's paying us back in the long run. Another great reason to garden, and one of the reasons that most gardeners that I know say they participate in gardening, is because it's relaxing. Most people who like to garden really get some enjoyment out of digging in the dirt, and they also like just the feeling of getting away from all of the stress of everyday life, which we surely need now. In fact, gardening has been clinically shown to reduce blood pressure, and it is a part of many therapeutic programs. When you garden, you will get higher quality produce than you could ever buy in any store. And people are starting to realize that. And people more and more like to participate in gardening for that very reason. And now during this, this pandemic, it's an even greater reason, because we want to make sure we're eating nutritional produce, and you can't get any better nutrition than eating produce that you've grown in your own backyard. Commercial growers, when they bring produce to market, they have to consider whether or not the produce will withstand the shipping process. Almost all produce that you get in the grocery store has been picked before it is ripe. Produce that's allowed to ripen on the plant will have up to 80% higher nutritional value than any produce you could buy in the store. And that's just an amazing number if you think about it. 80% more nutritional value. That's a huge reason to garden in your yard. Another excellent reason is that there is less exposure to chemicals. You're in absolute control over the chemicals that you put on your garden plants when you're gardening in your own yard. Even if you buy organic produce in the grocery store, there's still going to be a certain amount of chemical contamination. It won't be synthetic chemicals, because that's not allowed on organic produce, but there still are chemicals used. They're just natural chemicals that are used on organic gardening. If you're growing in your own yard, you can absolutely control what's being put, what pesticides or herbicides are being put on your plants. And finally, you can grow a far greater variety of produce from seeds than you could ever buy in a store. Because again, commercial growers are looking for vegetables that are going to look really good on the grocery store shelves and that are going to stand up to shipping. And quite frankly, most heirloom type of vegetables just don't meet that criteria, so you won't see them in the grocery stores. So if you want some of the more unusual types of heirloom vegetables, a great way to do that is to grow them from seed yourself. Now, when the first time I started a garden of my own, it was quite a long time ago now, but I looked through gardening magazines and I had an idea in my head of what I wanted that garden to look like. And in my head, I wanted something just like this: beautiful beds, maybe some flowers around the border, big wide paths to walk through. I thought maybe I would get fancy and add some containers, maybe a little seating area. Ultimately, I decided, well, maybe I'll just keep it a little simple. I'll do rows of vegetables, just like I remember my mother doing. And I wanted to grow all of the wonderful things that I remembered as a child that she grew. I wanted squash and cucumbers, corn, tomatoes, carrots. And I thought I would save a ton of money by planting everything from seed. And this is pretty much what I ended up with. Unfortunately, I started too late in the season. I tried to grow everything from seed. And when I started, it was far too warm. The squash and cucumbers took over the garden. Sunlight couldn't get to anything except for perhaps the weeds. And almost everything died because it was being crowded out by weeds and the squash. And really, I didn't get anything edible out of that first garden. And I'd like to save you that same experience. So if you don't get anything out of this presentation at all, except for these two things, you're going to be farther along than I was. Number one, do your research. Now, that's easier than ever these days. The first place you want to start is the back of the seed package or the tag of the plant that you've bought from your nursery. And these days, it's easier than ever to get online, Google the plant you want to grow, find out its growing habits, and how much space it requires in the garden. The second thing you should do if this is your first garden is start small. It is so easy to get carried away that a lot of times first-time gardeners start way too large, the project becomes overwhelming, and they don't set themselves up for success. So number one, do your research. Number two, start small. So you've been in your beginning classes for a while now, so you know that there's only 4 basic things that any plant needs in order to survive. And this is true for all plants, not just vegetable plants. But when you're in the planting stages of your garden, you have to keep in mind that you need to provide all of these things in order for your garden to succeed. So the 4 things are light, water, nutrients, and oxygen. When you're considering your site selection for your garden, you have to consider that you are going to try and provide those 4 things to your plants in order to have a successful garden. Number 1 is light, or the sun, the amount of sun that your garden site will have. And this is the number 1 reason that gardens fail, and that's because of inadequate light. Almost all vegetable plants require full sun. And full sun means between 6 and 12 hours of full blazing sun every day. And this isn't one of those things where, you know, you look at your backyard and you say, oh, well, there's a bunch of trees there. I don't really think that they'll cause much shade. You really have to know, because it can make a big difference between whether your garden is productive or whether your garden just barely produces anything. The general recommendation is that whatever the size of the garden you end up with, you should plan to have at least 85% of it in full blazing sun. And if the area, if you just can't manage it, to have only 15% in part sun. And part sun is considered between 4 and 6 hours of sunlight a day. And you can reserve that 15% for herbs, because herbs can handle a certain amount of shade. The next thing is that you want your garden site to have access to water, and preferably to a garden hose or in-ground irrigation, because there is nothing that will doom your garden quicker than having to water your garden on a 95-degree summer day with a watering can. What invariably happens is that you underestimate the amount of water the garden needs, and then it struggles. The next thing you need is well-drained soil. That's either in ground, which we'll talk about a little later, because most of our native soil requires some amending to be considered well-drained. And you need to provide nutrients, and nutrients can take many forms. It can be a purchased fertilizer, or you can do your own compost. So then you have to decide the type of garden that you want to have. And sometimes the type of garden you want to have is dictated by the site. So if you go out into your yard and the only place that is full sun for 6 to 12 hours a day is a small patio, well, then you're probably going to have a container garden. If you have a large, fairly level ground or yard, maybe you can have a traditional in-ground garden. And if you don't have any level space in your yard, maybe you want to go with raised beds. So let's talk about the traditional in-ground garden. This is by far the most common type of garden, and for good reason. The soil is already there, So you're going to have less of a monetary investment because the soil exists. An in-ground garden retains water better, which is a consideration in our climate where we have very hot summers. When vegetables are growing, they require quite a lot of water, and a garden that retains water better may be a consideration. An in-ground garden will also give you more room for vining crops like cucumbers, squash, watermelon, and pumpkins, which generally take up a very large amount of space, and they're a little bit more difficult in smaller gardens. And because of the larger area, you're going to be able to have a larger variety of vegetables. Now, on the flip side, the initial soil preparation requires a very high labor investment. Anyone who's ever tried to dig a hole in our native soil can understand that trying to prepare a full garden bed is going to require a lot of labor. Because remember, this is a vegetable garden, so you're going to have to remove all of the existing vegetation from your site before you start. And you're not going to want to use chemical herbicides because those stay dormant in the soil for a little while, and you don't want those in your vegetables. So your only choices are really to either till and rake and pull whatever weeds and grass are already in your site, or you can cover the ground with, newspapers, plastic, or sheeting material. Wait a month until the vegetation dies, and that will improve the labor required to then remove the dead vegetation. Some people decide that the amount of labor required just isn't feasible, and they decide to go the way of a raised bed garden. And a raised bed garden can be as simple as mounding a pile of soil and amendments higher than the surrounding area, or you can choose frameworks of wood or stone in order to make raised bed gardens. Now, it has a higher initial cost of establishment because you're going to have to provide the actual soil. Typically, you use a combination of soil amendments like peat, perlite, sand, and compost to create a well-drained mix that'll provide some soil structure for your plants. Another benefit of a raised bed garden is that it uses space more efficiently. You typically design a raised bed to be no more than 4 feet across so that you can easily reach in to weed and groom your plants from any side. And so that means you don't have to leave a lot of space for walking, so you don't have to take care of that in-between space. On the downside, a raised bed garden definitely requires more water because the soil that you use generally drains much more quickly than our native soil. Finally, if you just want to start very simply, a simple container garden may be the way to go. There's not a huge investment. It's easy to maintain. And if you start simple, like this strawberry pot, you'll be successful and you can expand as you go. Here's a very creative use of a cheap over-the-door storage door organizer that's been lined with cocoa fiber. So you can see that a container garden can be made of just about anything. And here is a combination of an in-ground and a raised bed garden. Sometimes you're going to want to confine certain plants, such as chives and mint, even if you do use an in-ground garden, because they can quickly overrun the garden because they multiply so quickly. And if you're going to have a garden, you're going to need some garden tools. So generally speaking, the larger the garden tools. If you're going to have an in-ground garden, you're going to need a tiller, a rake, a hoe. And if you do something more simple like container gardening, you might get away with using a trowel. But by far, the most important tool for the garden is the hose. Because if you don't have in-ground irrigation, you and your hose are the irrigation. And you're going to want to do yourself a favor at the beginning of the season. Make sure your hose and nozzle are in good working order, because nothing makes this chore more of a nuisance than having a leaking water hose. Now, that being said, most vegetable gardens, while they're in the vegetative stage, use about an inch of water per week. So that means if it doesn't rain an inch during the week, you and your garden hose need to provide that water. The best way to water with a garden hose is to go beneath the canopy of the leaves and to saturate the soil right at the roots. When the leaves get moist, it's easier for disease and pests to spread on the plants, and you want to avoid that if possible. Now, that being said, the best time to water would be in the morning, so that all day long the leaves have a chance to dry. But if you didn't get a chance to water in the morning and you come home from work and your poor little plants are all leaned over and wilting, by all means water them, because the most important thing is to keep the plants watered, and generally speaking, you'd like to keep them consistently watered. So now you have to decide, what do you plant? How do you decide what you're going to plant in your garden? Well, the first thing you should remember is to plant what you like to eat. It doesn't make any sense to plant things just because they're easy to grow. Plant what you like to eat, and that way you'll end up eating what you have produced, and you'll be hooked on gardening. Another thought is to plant fruits and vegetables that are expensive to buy in the store. Almost a third of our produce comes from California. They frequently have droughts, and that causes more expensive fruits and vegetables. Tomatoes, peppers, and leafy greens are among the most expensive vegetables to buy in the store, and they're a great option for a beginning gardener. Another option is to decide what to plant if you want to avoid chemicals. I don't know if you have all heard of this, but this list of vegetables is called the Dirty Dozen. And it is the fruits and vegetables that you purchased in the store that have the highest level of pesticide and herbicide chemical contamination. So for your first garden, you might not choose every one of these fruits or vegetables, but every one of these fruits and vegetables can be grown in Tennessee. So surely you could choose some of them to plant in your first garden. You will have a better garden if you make a garden plan. A garden plan forces you to do some research about the growth habits of your crop, and just doing that will make you a better gardener. You should have if you go ahead and make a garden plan, you should have a spring, a summer, and a fall garden plan. And at a minimum, your garden plan should be a sketch that shows the amount of space that each of your garden vegetable plants is going to require, so that you know how many plants you need in order to adequately and successfully grow in your garden area. I made this garden plan with an online gardening tool called growveg.com. And I like to use a gardening planning tool because a lot of the research is already done for you. But don't let this scare you. You can easily make your own garden plan just by drawing out your garden and checking the back of your seed package to see how far apart you should plant your plants, and by physically calculating how much space is needed for each plant. So in your spring garden, broccoli and the cole crops are definitely the staples of the spring garden. If you didn't plant them in your garden in the fall and overwinter them, you would need to buy seedlings from your garden center, and you could plant them out in your garden when the soil is warm enough to start working. This year it surely is at this time, and it has been for a little while. Your spring crops, if you have bought them from seedlings, should start going in the ground when the soil temperatures are between 50 and 58 degrees, and the air temperatures don't fall below freezing. So that being said, most of the spring crops are planted when there's still a danger of frost in the air, and you just have to be aware that if it is going to fall below freezing, it's somewhere around 28, you're going to have to cover tender seedlings because they just won't tolerate a freeze. Radishes, carrots, and beets are early crops that should be grown by seed. You don't see transplants in the garden centers because they just don't grow that well from transplants. They do better from seed. And you'll be surprised at how quickly the radishes, carrots, beets, and turnips actually sprout when you plant them at this time of the year. All you'll do is you will make a little trough in your soil, only about maybe a ½ inch deep. You'll plant your seeds about 1 inch apart, and you'll cover them very lightly. You should water them in very lightly just to keep them moist. And you might be surprised, but in as little as 7 days, you'll start seeing the seedlings emerge. Another great plant to plant right now in the spring is strawberries. And strawberries are usually best planted from seedlings that you purchase at the garden center, if it's your first time garden, because strawberry seedlings take quite a while to grow themselves, and you want at least, I would say, 3 to 4 leaves on a strawberry seedling before you plant it in the ground. So strawberries do great in well-drained soil. So if you have maybe a slight hill in your garden site, a south-facing hill would be a great place to plant strawberries. And one of the reasons for that is a slight hill will provide a well-drained area, and the very nature of strawberries has them laying on the ground. So one of the battles with strawberries is to keep the fruit dry and to keep them free of pests like slugs until they ripen. And once they do ripen, the other challenge is to keep the birds from them. But I'll tell you, strawberries are well worth the effort. And if you don't have a little hill, a strawberry pot is a great way to get started with strawberries. So the next season you want to worry about is called the summer garden season. And the summer garden season occurs between the first and the last frost dates in your, no, I'm sorry, I said that wrong. Between the last frost date and the first frost date in your area. In our area, we're in zone 7. The last frost is generally April 15th. Now that doesn't mean that we can't have a frost later. We have had frost all the way up until April 25th. So if you plant right at April 15th or even before, you just have to be prepared to cover your vegetables if we're going to get freezing temperatures. So this is my summer garden plan. I like to can salsa. And so in my garden, I would plant everything that I would need in order to make salsa. I do tomatoes, peppers, cilantro, onions, and garlic. And this particular garden is only 192 square feet, so it's a pretty small garden by most standards. But even at that small size, I was able to can 200 jars of salsa from this relatively small garden. Now, tomatoes are the #1 homegrown crop that there is. And there's probably very good reason for that. Tomatoes taste so much different when they are grown in your garden versus being purchased in the store. Tomatoes that you purchased in the store are picked green and they are allowed to ripen on the shelves. They generally have tougher skin and they're lacking flavor. When you grow a garden in your vegetable garden, and you allow it to ripen on the vine, man, it just tastes great. And it's almost like a store-bought tomato and a homegrown tomato are two different things. Now, when you plant tomatoes, you need to know what kind of tomatoes you're going to plant, and you need to know whether they're determinate or indeterminate. So if you like to can, like I do, or if you like to make salsa or spaghetti sauce, or you want to can your tomatoes, you're going to want to buy determinate tomatoes, because a determinate tomato produces the majority of their produce in a 4 to 6 week period. So that makes it easier for a home canner to prepare their canning products all at one time. An indeterminate tomato produces its harvest all throughout the growing season. So as long as that plant is growing, it's still producing fruit. If you like heirloom tomatoes, it's probably going to be an indeterminate tomato. Now, a determinate tomato plant grows only between 4 and 6 foot tall. An indeterminate tomato plant will grow as long as the temperature is adequate for it to grow. Generally in our area, an indeterminate tomato may get to be 8 to 10 feet. So, if you're going to plant tomatoes, you have to worry about plant support. I am sure all of you have seen in the garden center these little tomato cages. And these tomato cages are just great for a determinate tomato plant that grows between 4 and 6 feet tall. You should find if you're going to plant determinate tomatoes, you should find the largest tomato cage you can find with the thickest gauge wire. And you should plant your tomatoes and put the cage around the tomatoes at the same time, because it is really, really difficult once a plant starts bushing out and growing much more than 2 feet to get that cage around it without damaging the plant. Now, if you're going to grow indeterminate plants, which are the ones that produce all season long, you're going to need a much sturdier staking system than a little cage like this can provide. So in the center picture, you can see a wood and pipe arrangement. And on the far right, you see a PVC pipe arrangement. I've had considerable success with a combination of wooden supports and cages and stakes. But the important thing to remember is that you want to have your staking system in place before your plants need the support, because it is so difficult to stake a plant that's already fallen on the ground without damaging it. So if you like peppers, peppers are one of the greatest plants to use in a beginning garden. And the reason for that is they're very easy to grow, they're super productive, they're delicious, and there is really a pepper for almost everyone's taste. There's mild peppers, medium peppers, and for the crazy people, there's the super, super hot peppers that you have to be careful with. So the best advice that I can give you is to have fun and to end up eating what you grow. So you want to set yourself up for success. Any questions? Determinate varieties so that you can stake them and allow them the room that they need to grow, because they really will produce more fruit if you give them adequate space than if you try and crowd them in altogether.
Another question close to that. It says, will the label tell you if it's determinate or indeterminate?
Normally it does, but you know, you have to do your homework. Sometimes the label doesn't give you as much practical information as you might like. And then it's up to you to do a little further research, such as, you know, going online and looking to see whether that variety is determinate or indeterminate, whether it's a hybrid or an heirloom. That can kind of give you an indication, not always, but if it's an heirloom, there's a good chance that it's indeterminate. So that'll kind of give you a way to go. And if it's a hybrid, there is a good chance that it's determinate. Again, not always, but it'll give you an indication.
Maggie wants to know if my seedlings are tall and lanky right now. Should I start over, and how do you avoid that?
Well, so when we're talking about seedlings, it depends what type of seedling we're talking about. If you're talking about a tomato seedling, that is one of the few plants that you can plant deep, meaning that you can kind of strip the leaves of all but the very top leaves and plant it way, way deep in the soil so that only the very top leaves are showing. The tomato plant will actually get roots along its stem. If you're talking about most other plants, however, if you have a tall, lanky seedling, it's going to be much more difficult to plant that seedling and to get a quality plant out of it.
She said basil. She said she had basil and lettuce.
Well, basil, that's not too bad. You can pinch the basil. And if you pinch off some of the lankier stemmy pieces, maybe 2 or 3 leaves lower on the stem, that will encourage the plant to branch. And so you can do that with almost all herbs.
Hey, Tatiana had a question. What is good to grow in 5-gallon buckets? Tatiana, can you turn on your mute? I asked your question. I think you typed it in. Is that okay?
So in a 5-gallon bucket, pepper plants would be excellent to grow. You can actually also grow cucumbers and squash. You're only going to want to put 1 plant in there. You can certainly grow lettuce, certainly grow beans. And when I say beans, I'm talking about string beans. I don't know if a pole bean is going to work that well in a 5-gallon bucket. You can do strawberries. I mean, a 5-gallon bucket's a pretty good size. So you can do almost anything except for corn, okra, some of the really tall plants that just need more support than, you know, a 5-gallon bucket is going to provide. Now, keep in mind too, if you're planting in a 5-gallon bucket, you're going to want to make sure that you drill holes, drainage holes in the bottom of that bucket so that it doesn't just endlessly collect water and drown the roots.
Howard said he had a suggestion for those interested in container tomatoes. Howard, do you want to give that suggestion?
Yes, I've been following a fellow named Leon on YouTube. Do a search on YouTube for Gardening with Leon, and he advocates something he calls wicking tubs. And all my life, anytime I've grown anything in a container, I've done just the way we've been talking here, putting drainage holes in the bottom, and the water just floods right on through. Leon puts one hole in the side.
Yep.
And then he's got a system where it creates a reservoir for water in the bottom of that container. And I won't try to describe how to build it here, but if you'll go to YouTube and do a search for Gardening with Leon and look up wicking tubs, he grows determinate tomatoes in those things. He uses tubs that are 15-gallon or 15 to 18-gallon tubs. He sits them up on a stand, and then instead of staking the tomatoes, he puts a determinate tomato in them and lets them grow up and come down toward the ground. But because they're determinate, they seldom reach the ground, so you don't have to stake them at all. So it's worth looking at. I just wanted to throw that out there.
I can comment on that too. We've been looking into that. Katie Bishop, who's our vegetable guru, you know, over at the food bank, she's done some of those, and sometimes they're called earth gardens or earth boxes.
Yeah.
And the same situation, same concept is that you have a reservoir of water, maybe 2 inches in the bottom, and it's very good for people who forget to water. Especially, you can wick the water up to the soil on the top layer. I've seen other ones where the Memphis gardeners were talking about using a pump, which looked a little bit more complicated to me, but they were using a pump, pump the water up and then spray over top of the plants. Let's go to another question. Tatiana, do you have a question?
Well, I already asked about 5-gallon buckets.
Okay, I keep seeing your,
Oh, my hand. I guess I need to take it away.
yeah, okay.
Sorry.
Yeah, all right.
I just don't know how.
Yeah, that's all right. We're all learning. Let's see, there was one question. How do you prune tomato plants? Did we cover that one?
No, I don't think we did. Now, a tomato plant, much like any other plant, has a central stem, and one of those branches is going to be taller than the rest. And if you want a bushier plant, you can pinch that one very tall central leader back down to the first nodule that you see, and that will encourage the plant to branch more. I always like to make sure that I keep the interior of the plant pruned of any branches that cross another branch or that head into the interior of the plant, so that the plant has adequate air circulation. And it's kind of frightening to do right from the get-go, because you keep on thinking, uh-oh, am I pruning everything off that is going to end up, you know, producing a tomato? But if you keep the air circulation going, you're going to find that the tomato plant sends out more shoots, and that's ultimately the ultimate important part, is to make sure that you have healthy stems on your plants, as opposed to just a whole bunch of them that are all crossing each other, because eventually the weight of those stems that cross each other will kill the foliage and vegetation that's underneath the top layer.
That's good. Does anyone else have any questions?
I got in the Master Gardeners in '94. Stephanie and I met, and then we got married in 2005, and she actually became a Master Gardener because she felt like she would never see me if she didn't. So during that time, she has actually become one of the best speakers with a lot that I've recruited into this group. And so she's learned a lot. She is the only person that I've known that has a daylily named after her, which costs $100 if you buy it online. But anyway, Stephanie is very good at doing presentations, and so tonight shouldn't be anything any different. So with that, I give you my better half, Stephanie Payne.
Good evening, everyone. Just give you a little background on the perennial and annual talk. Normally, this is one of the ones I really enjoy giving, not that I'm not going to enjoy it tonight as well, but normally I stand up in front of the class and do a demonstration. We've all gotten so caught up in PowerPoints that I really enjoy doing this one just on my own and using different props and different plants. But given the limitations we have now, I did prepare a PowerPoint. So this has been put together pretty fast because I didn't have it actually 2 weeks ago because we were still able to meet face to face. So this is the first time I'm giving this presentation. So if you will bear with me and be a little patient, I would appreciate it. So we're all doing this kind of together for the first time. So let's get started. Perennials and annuals. First of all, what is a perennial? That's the question we need to ask and answer. And that's a plant that lives for more than 2 years. There are different kinds of perennials. You've got your hardy perennials, herbaceous, woody, semi-woody, and tender perennials. Now your hardy perennials, they're gonna tolerate that frost. It's not gonna matter how cold it gets, even if they die back all the way to the ground. A couple of examples are yarrow and columbine. They can grow in very cold areas. It all depends, you know, on your hardiness zone, and we'll go over that as well. Now, most of the perennials are going to be your herbaceous perennials. Those are the ones that die back to the root every winter. That's the one, you know, you have to get out in the garden and you have to cut back in the fall. Then you've got your woody perennials that have a little bit of a woody base and stems. And can you think of an example of that? Wouldn't that be maybe hydrangeas are considered a woody perennial? And then of course, you've got your tender perennials. And those are the ones that can't overwinter outdoors, but kind of survive on the border here, like lantana. I consider a tender perennial here, but really it's not native to here, and it's from Florida, and it's really a tropic, but it can overwinter here if you're careful. We have a very mild winter. Now, trees and shrubs are actually considered perennials because they live for more than 2 years. But we kind of segregate those off into another category. So we're not going to talk about those so much tonight, as we're going to talk about your smaller shrubs like hydrangeas, maybe gardenias, that type of perennial. And perennials you'll find grow slower than annuals. And they don't always bloom right away, especially if you buy a smaller plant or you grow from seed. So normally you might want to invest a little bit more money when you buy your perennials and get a larger plant. And I have a question. What's the largest herbaceous flowering perennial? Now, nobody has to answer. I'm going to give you the answer. It's the banana tree. But and what other item does it share as well? It's the largest herb as well. I like throwing out trivia every once in a while. Oh, went backwards, sorry. Whoop. So here are some perennials. You can see the daylily to the left. That would be considered a hardy perennial, also an herbaceous perennial. It dies back to the ground. And there you've got a oak leaf hydrangea that's native to this area. It's a great perennial. It can take our winter. You've got the lantana, and then of course the banana tree, the hardy banana. We started a hardy banana in our backyard, and Linda can attest to, because we gave them away to everyone. When you have one, you're going to have 20 within a couple of years. And they are, oh yeah, they are great. great plants to be a filler in the background. They're wonderful. We enjoy them tremendously. And so now we've discussed perennials. What is an annual? That's a plant that completes its life cycle in one season. And it's usually very showy. Those are the ones that get a lot of color. You get a lot of, with perennials, you're getting usually seasonal blooms and color. But with annuals, they're trying to do their best to procreate and get those seeds out and get growing fast. So you get annuals that may reseed, like these zinnias on your left. They reseed. You could cut the tops off of them. This is one of my favorite plants of all time, because you can get them in all different colors, shapes, and sizes. Cut the tops off when they dry out a little bit, put them in a brown paper bag over the winter, and you have your seeds for next year. Petunias are also a great annual. They're one of my favorites for the early in the season. The heat kind of gets them toward the summer, unless you got them in some partial shade, but they're a great annual as well. Now like when I said with perennials that you might want to buy larger plants, well, with annuals, they grow so fast during the season, that's where you can buy the smaller plants. And if you notice when you go to the nursery, you're going to see those annuals in those 6-packs that you can buy, where perennials you're going to see in usually the larger pint to a gallon tubs. And as Linda talked about tonight, vegetables are normally considered annuals. Now that we know what an annual and a perennial is, okay, now we need to get started out there in our garden. Well, you need some basic gardening tools, right? You need your pruners, a good trowel, a cultivator, a small spade at least, definitely gloves, a bucket, and something to help you while you're out there in the garden, because you're going to be out there a lot if you have a garden. Now you can see that we have here, notice the bypass pruning shears. Those are the ones to the left. To me, those are the best ones to get, because they are more like scissors. They make a clean cut and the blades pass by each other. And whenever you make the cut, you want to use that top thicker blade. As you can see, you want that on the top. And then if you look here next to the woman sitting on the chair, I had one of these, and they are the best in the garden, because they will swivel and you can lean forward. I don't know about you, but if I'm sitting on just a stationary stool, I lean forward too far, I'm in the garden, face first. And then gloves. I can't reiterate how important gloves are to the garden. When I first started gardening, I like to get the feel of the dirt on my hands. And when I moved up here, Mike was horrified that I didn't garden with gloves on, because you can get those little cuts and scrapes as you're gardening, because you get little rocks and things, thorns, and you can get a nasty infection from the bacteria and fungi that lives in the soil. You can get a staph infection. So you definitely want to invest in some good gloves, even if it's just some type of the surgical gloves, the latex gloves, something to cover your hands. I mean, they have all different kinds of fancy gloves these days. And then on the far right, you'll see that a bucket, and you can see that it has the apron around it. How many people think about it? It's a great way to organize your tools, and also have a place to put your weeds or to carry around additional tools. Fertilizer, that's very important to the garden as well. A good 10-10-10, as you can see, is an all-purpose fertilizer. It's what's called NPK. I think Mike talked a little bit about that on his grass talk the other night. The nitrogen's for greenery, and the phosphorus is for blooms, and the potassium, of course, gets you those nice, strong roots. So you definitely want to invest in some good fertilizer for your garden. It helps out the soil here, as Linda talked about. Our soil's not the best in the world. So a good fertilizer can really help your garden out. Let's talk a little bit about soil pH. In Tennessee, our soil on average tends to be more acidic. But sometimes, as you can see on the chart here, that it needs to be pretty much neutral. As you can see, the plant will take up better the nutrients, the micronutrients in the soil, if it's a little bit more neutral, from 6 to 7, where 7 is neutral, alkaline's 14. That's, whew, I don't know anything that grows in that basic of a soil. Now, there are some plants that on average like the soil to be more acidic. And of course, everybody knows one of those is azaleas, like it a little bit more acidic, from 4.5 to 5.5. And forsythia, it likes it a little bit more alkaline, from 6.5 to 7.5. Now, how do you know what the pH is of your soil? Well, that's when you have to take a soil test, which is what you should do periodically whenever you're working in your garden. Every couple of years, maybe take a soil test, see where you are, see what type of nutrients you need to add so you can get the right type of fertilizer and add it to the garden. Now, I was one that I like to have blue hydrangeas. And hydrangeas are one of those plants that can kind of go either way. It's not that picky, but it'll determine the bloom on the plant. When we had our garden, we had all pink. It's a little bit more acidic soil. So if you want to have pink and you don't have pink, you need to add lime. If you want a blue, which I did want, I had Mike add that ammonium sulfate so I could get those pretty blue blooms. There's some people that had, I have never been able to attain it, that had deep, deep purple blooms. Those were one of the most beautiful hydrangeas that I had ever seen. All right, preparing your bed, as Linda was talking about too as well. The very first thing you want to do is lay out your bed. Determine how big a bed you want, where you want it. Is it going to be in full sun, partial shade, and shade? Because that's going to determine what kind of plants you plant there. And then you've got to be careful around trees, because remember when Lisa Limza was talking, they have very shallow roots, and if you really mess around a tree, you're gonna disturb those roots. When Mike and I did our shade garden, we pretty much didn't prepare the ground, but we used very small plants and plants that really didn't need a lot of care, like hostas. And they loved the shade, and they did very well around the trees. And whenever you're laying out your bed, of course, you got to remove that existing vegetation, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. There's different ways to remove that vegetation. And of course, once you get those existing vegetation out, you're going to want to till down 8 to 12 inches, because our soil is not the easiest to work with. In fact, when I first moved here, I almost decided to move back because I put my shovel in the ground and I almost broke my ankle. So I was used to sand. So it was very, very disheartening when I first started gardening here, when I realized that, hey, I've got to pretty much improve all of the beds that I wanted to have. And you want to improve the whole bed. You don't want to just plant the plants in the ground, kind of like we talked about trees, that you don't want to amend the soil. But with the perennial and annual gardens, you definitely do want to amend the soil and amend the whole garden as well. And then of course, once you mix down and till in the dirt, you're going to have to mix in some organic materials, because it's just the way it is here. And Mike and I used to use mushroom compost, topsoil, and river sand. And we used to get a third. And we would mix that in very well, 8 to 12 inches down. Then of course, after you do that, you want to cover your bed with mulch, and you might want to use some weed and feed as well, just so that your weed seeds that are left in the soil don't sprout. And of course, a border always helps keep the grass out, because as soon as you have that bed and you've taken grass out, guess what's going to happen? It's going to try to get back in. So you're going to be unfortunately, going to be continually finding the grass, especially if you have any type of Bermuda grass. Now let me talk about a little bit about removing existing vegetation. There's many ways to remove the vegetation. It depends on how much time you had. The fastest, of course, is manually. Let me go ahead and move to this picture. Would be manually removing the grass. But that's very labor intensive. But everybody's home now, maybe people have time to do that. And of course, herbicide, that is another way to remove some of the weeds and grasses whenever you're doing a bed. But of course, you end up having to wait for that herbicide to leach back out of the soil. And that could take up to 2 weeks to 4 weeks. So you have to have time on your hands. Like if you're preparing your garden in the winter for the spring, then perhaps you have that time. And then of course, even slower is smothering. That could take up to 6 to 12 months if you really want to do a good job of covering that area and blocking the sunlight and smothering the grass and weeds. And there's also solarization, and that can take up to 4 to 6 weeks. And that's whenever you use a plastic over it so that the ground heats up and kills all the weeds in the grass. So depending on how much time you have, you might have to get out there and manually do it, or you can have the slower way to do it if you have some time. And it's best to work when the soil's moist, but not wet. And then whenever you want to mix in and till in the dirt, of course, a tiller is the best way to do it. You can always do it by hand. It's great exercise, but again, that's going to take some time and some effort. And of course, as Linda said, raised beds are always easiest because you don't have to really go through all this. You pretty much put down your border. Maybe you want to put some type of weed barrier, and then you can go ahead and fill it. But again, that's also expensive as well. And that is great for vegetables. We always used a raised bed for vegetables. So once you've prepared your bed, next you want to go and you want to buy your plants. Excuse me. The first thing you want to determine is, okay, I have my bed prepared. Is it part shade? Is it sun? Is it shady? And that's going to determine what kind of plants you're going to put in this garden. Well, of course, you have a label. Read the label. If it says it is sun, you want to make sure you put it in the sun. I have tried to cheat and put a sun plant in partial shade, and all it did was reach for the sun. So you definitely want to look at your label, follow it. The mature height and width, you want to follow that too. It is so tempting when you buy small plants to go ahead and put them closer together than what's recommended on the plant label. I would even recommend you put it a little bit farther apart, because it just seems they grow a little bit bigger, especially if they like where they are. Now, Mike used to come behind me when I would plant my zinnias. We'd start them seedlings and I'd plant them, and he would come in, because I'd plant them really close together. He'd come in and grab them all back and space them so they looked like they were, you know, where are you? There's no plants in my bed. But of course, once they got mature, they filled the bed completely. Then you want to pay attention to bloom season. That was another thing that I had to adjust my thoughts about when I moved here. In Florida, everything bloomed year round pretty much. Well, here things don't bloom as year round, especially on your perennials. They're going to have a season. So you want to consider having multiple blooms in your garden so that you don't have just all greenery at one point in time. And of course, hardiness zone, pretty much if they sell it in this area, you would think that it would be able to grow in this area. But you want to check your hardiness zone. Like if you're in Florida and you're buying some plants, well, what's hardy in Florida is not necessarily hardy here. And we'll talk more about the hardy zone as well. So when you go to the nursery, definitely pay attention to your labels. Now you want to save these labels as well. Because if you're like me, sometimes I'll buy something that I've not bought before and I won't remember what it is. And then consider this as well, especially on your perennials that die back to the ground, labeling them so you know where they are. Mike and I have actually tried to plant something where we already had something planted because we thought it wasn't coming up as quick as we thought it was. We thought we had an empty area that had died. Well, we had a plant there. So definitely consider labeling your plants as well, even if it's with just a popsicle stick and a Sharpie, putting that out, especially whenever you cut your perennials back so that you know where you've planted things. Because we used to have so many plants I'd forget. Nope, let me see, can I go? Okay. Another thing, whenever you're buying plants, you are well within your right to check those roots, and you should check the roots. Because plants are wonderful, the beautiful greenery and flowers are great, but you've got to have good roots or your plant's not going to live. So you want to check the roots. You want vigorous roots, but look at some of these. Look at this one on the right. Look at how what's the word for it, Mike? It's root bound. See how root bound it is? They're just going to grow on top of each other, grow on top. Now you might be able to cut that root, cut them a little bit and open it up, but that's pretty root bound and I would not buy that plant because that plant's been sitting at the nursery probably all winter long. Now this one over here to the left isn't so bad, but it's getting root bound there as well. And see how it's turned over and you kind of gently shake it out, but you have every right to look at the roots whenever you go buy a plant. And if somebody at that nursery or big box store tells you not to do that, you need to go someplace else to buy your plant because you're not going to get a good plant from them. And also, whenever you're looking for plants, you want that vigorous growth over blooms. When I first was shopping for plants, I always want something that had lots of blooms on it. Well, really that vigorous growth's the best thing whenever you're buying plants. You want something that's healthy and growing well as the good roots. So you've gone to the nursery, you've prepared your bed, you've gone to the nursery, you've got your plants. So the next thing, of course, is planting your plants. I recommend that you arrange your plants prior to planting in the pots. It's much easier to make changes and to rearrange when they're in the pots than if you've just gone ahead and planted them and you step back and of course you're going, oh no, that doesn't work for me. So definitely maybe do it in a couple days, let it sit for overnight, come back and see if that's how you like it. And of course you want to space those plants based on their maturity, because you don't want a tall plant in front of a short plant. So definitely take that in consideration. Now, whenever you take your plant out of the pot, like I was showing you, sometimes those roots have nowhere to go, so they're going to start growing in on themselves. So you want to gently tease those roots out and give them some space. And whenever you dig your hole, you want your hole just a little bit bigger so that you can get those roots plenty of room. And whenever you cover it up, and then of course you want to water and then mulch your plants after planting. Here's some examples. Here's on the right, you can see they're kind of teasing those roots out. I mean, I've gone so far as to take a trowel if it was a little bit root bound and make cuts in the plant, but of course you're kind of hurting the roots, so there's always a chance that the plant won't do well. And you can see here they've marked out the bed on the left, and they're watering the plants in. They're going to see how they like them. And here's a finished bed on the left. Looks nice, doesn't it? I mean, they look like they're a little far apart, but they're going to grow. And that's the hardest thing. It really is hard not to try to get them, because I like it now. If then that's the case, you need to buy bigger plants. But don't waste your money on annuals, big annuals. They'll grow. And of course, here's a little bit more mature bed where things have grown together on the right-hand side. Now you've got your bed planted. Now we got to talk about plant care. Well, of course, watering is very important. Like Linda said, 1 inch a week at least. In the middle of the summer, you might need a little bit more. Irrigation is always preferable if you can have it. Now with fertilization, usually perennials, you want to fertilize early spring and end of summer. Annuals, we used to use a liquid fertilizer about every 3 weeks. We used to use the bloom buster and fertilize our annuals. Granular fertilizer is good once during the season, especially for your potted and your hanging baskets as well as giving them maybe a little bit of liquid fertilizer as well. I like Osmocote too. I like that fertilizer. Remember that you have your containers. You're going to need more water than just 1 inch a week, especially like if you have those clay pots out in the heat. Now, what about pruning? Well, your early bloomers and plants, you're going to want to prune those right after they bloom. Now, of course, if you have a cross branch, feel free to prune as you go as well to make it look better. But you don't want to cut off the bloom that's setting for next year. And one of those historically is people that cut back their azaleas later in the year, they get no blooms. In fact, we had somebody one time come and ask us, why aren't my hydrangeas ever blooming? I cut them back every fall. Well, especially if you've got ones that not like a endless summer that blooms on new and old wood. If you've got one of the more heirloom type hydrangeas, they're going to set their blooms as soon as once they bloom out, they're going to grow and set their bloom. So you need to prune them as early as possible after they bloom. Now, most others, late winter, early spring, we never pruned our knockout roses until early March, and our butterfly bushes until early March. Again, cut off anything that's damaged, and you're gonna have to kind of prune a little bit here and there during the season. Now, remember I said I'd talk about the hardiness zone. I kind of like to talk about this because hardiness is kind of a relative term for a plant. We get a lot of our plants from the Midwest. We get a lot of our prairie plants from there. So their hardiness zone's a little bit different than the native plants here. So be aware of that, of where your plant's coming from as well. But a hardiness is only about cold tolerance. It's how cold the plant, what temperatures the plants will survive through. It doesn't really talk about heat. Some of the labels I've been seeing lately do have a heat tolerance as well, because plants that that grow well in Oregon might not grow well here because they just can't take our heat. So be aware of that as well when you get your plants, that it's not just cold hardiness, but you want to think about heat hardiness as well. And also what's sold as a perennial in Florida might be an annual here, like lantana is a good example, pentas is a good example. So you can get this chart, like you can see what, I'll show the next one is just our region, but you can go to this plant hardiness, ARS-USDA.gov, but most of the labels are going to have your hardiness on there for you. And here's a Southeast one that shows us we're pretty much 7A, 7B, 7A being more in the higher elevations. I think most of us here in the valley, we fall pretty much in 7B, but realize you can have microclimates as well, like on a southern facing area that's maybe got some concrete around it, you're going to have, you might be up there in the 8 zone because of the warmth that it collects during the day from the sun. So you can have a microclimate as well in your yard. Dividing. So now you've got your beautiful garden, and now it's maturing. And hey, my daylilies aren't blooming as much. My iris aren't blooming as much. What's going on? Well, they need to be divided. Whenever you start after about 4 years, you're going to see they're going to be beautiful and green, but you're not going to get much bloom out of them. And that's when you want to divide them. And that's when you want to call your friends and share the bounty with them. So you can actually dig up, like say a daylily, those roots, you can cut it in. Mike's mistreated our daylilies. Oh, you would just think they would get up and walk away, but you can half it with a shovel, as you can see in the picture on the right, or you can layer. We used to layer our hydrangeas all the time, and then we would dig up the babies after about 6 months, and we would have tons of plants to share. Another is you can take cuttings and root them, use some root hormone and root them. And you can get great cuttings that way. And of course, perennials can seed as well. So you can get seeds from some of your perennials, like the coneflower. You can cut the dried flowers and you can get seeds, and that's a good way to divide your perennials. And usually whenever you're dividing the perennials, it's best to divide the plants in the fall and early spring, because remember, you have disturbed, especially if you're halving, you've disturbed the roots, and it's going to be a little bit of a struggle for the plant to come back, and you don't want to have them doing this in the heat. So it's best in the fall, where they have all fall and winter, for those roots to grow strong again. Containers. Well, containers are a great way to have perennials and annuals, especially annuals. And normally whenever you do a container, you want to have what's called a spiller, a filler, and a thriller. And you can see in this picture, you have the thriller is the tall grassy plant in the background, and the filler would be the lantana, and then the spiller would be the potato plant. So that's kind of like the formula that you use for your containers. And just remember that containers are going to need more water, but the nice thing is they're portable. You could fill them in spots that don't have any color. They can be moved around. And also remember, whenever you get a container, it always has to have a hole. I cannot believe they even sell containers without holes, but they do. I have found that to cover the hole so you don't get dirt leaching out the bottom is a coffee filter. Works very well to cover the hole, and yet the water can pass through. So, and try Googling 101 uses for a coffee filter. One is coffee. There are other 100, there's all kinds of different things to do with the coffee filter. So just remember, annuals, they add color to the landscaping, and they're great for the pots and hanging baskets. And they're good to kind of plant as a border around in front of the perennials. Now the perennials, they provide structure and seasonal color. Think of the perennials as your bones and the annuals as your accessories whenever you buy your plants. And here are a few of my favorite annuals. Marigolds. I used to hate marigolds, but we used them as a companion plant one year with our vegetable garden, and I just fell in love with them. Begonias. Linda actually taught me to love begonias with her dragon wing begonias and the huge ones in hanging baskets. They're wonderful. And then of course, cosmos, the middle one, cosmos. They're a great annual for any garden. Then sunflowers. This is a Mexican sunflower over to the far right. The butterflies love it. But any type of sunflower adds interest and depth to your garden. Then favorite perennials. #1 favorite over there to the left, Homestead verbena. It's a great performer. It blooms pretty much from spring to fall, and it'll come back. It's kind of I would say, it's not quite tender, but it'll definitely come back in the spring, but you might not get the main plant. You might get, we call them sisters that have layered and grown off the main flower. We have black and blue salvia. In fact, Mike was just talking about that last night, that if you want some black and blue salvia, if you come down to the hummingbird and butterfly garden between the 2 aquariums, there's plenty. If you have 1 salvia, you're going to have 100, but they're absolutely beautiful. They're easy. They perform well. And then of course, cone flowers are one of my favorites as well. They come in all shapes, colors, sizes now, and they're great performers as well. They're easy to grow in the garden. They'll come back year after year. But most of all, you just want to have a great garden, and you want to have a place to sit in your garden so that you'll stay out there and enjoy it. What's the use of having a garden if you can't enjoy it? So, any questions? But I cover everything you needed to know about perennials and annuals.
Great.
Pests on perennials and annuals?
I didn't hear you.
What about pests?
Pests. Well, you're going to have pests. You always have, and like Linda was saying, I try not to use insecticides in my garden because I usually had a butterfly garden. So I would either manually remove them. Normally your pests aren't going to damage your plants too much. I know, like the beetles, the Japanese beetle will get your knockout roses, but they don't, I've never seen it where they've actually killed them.
There's a question on there, Stephanie, that's, I don't know if you want to cover it, but it's on, what about layering? How do you do layering?
Layering, well, normally what you would do is you would find kind of a low growing branch of the plant, because obviously it's got, you're layering, you're putting in the ground, so it's got to be low growing. That's why it works so well for hydrangeas. And Mike would just nick the root, just, I mean, the branch just a little bit, dig it into the, like force it into the ground right there, and then put a rock, a brick usually works very well, and just leave it for usually what, about a couple months, six months. Now you can use rooting hormone as well, but you don't, he didn't, he just used to put them in the ground.
Does that work for camellias also?
I haven't really tried camellias. Camellias, you want something that's a little more woody. Hydrangeas and azaleas work great.
Pretty woody. Camellias are pretty
But
woody.
that's what I'm saying, though. I've never tried it. You can try it once if you've got some low branches there. Strip back the leaves on it, and to entice it a little bit, put a little bit of rooting hormone on where that leaf node is, and lay a rock on it right where it touches the ground. It's worth a try, because if it roots, then all you got to do in a few months, if it gets roots on it and becomes stable, just clip it right there and it should be fine.
Yes, you can do camellias. I just looked it up. The joy of sitting in front of a computer screen. Yes, they're easier than you think. So yes, you can do camellias, but got to remember, I don't know about you, but my older camellias, they would usually be layered up already pretty high. So it's got to be a nice low branch. That's one of the criteria.
Okay, Suzanne asked, what are your 3 favorite perennials?
Well, cone flowers, definitely. Hydrangeas, definitely. What else do I love? Oh, the homestead verbena. Yeah. I love a stilby. Oh, for shade gardens, a stilby, because it's so hard to get really colorful plants for a shade garden, and it stilby comes in all different colors, and it grows great in shade. Well, not heavy shade, I would say, where you get kind of some sun, but mainly it could take mostly shade.
What are some other shade plants you might recommend?
Well, hosta is #1. And then you have goat's beard is great. It's white and wispy, so that adds an airiness to a shade area. Stilby, like I said.
Corabells, maybe? Corabells?
Corabells, yes. In the early spring, you got, well, in the early spring, you could put columbine. We used to have columbine in our shade garden because it would be done blooming by the time the tree leafed out. We had What else?
Denise
do we have
said,
in the garden?
Denise said bleeding heart.
Oh, that's it. Bleeding heart. Yes, love bleeding heart. We had that as well in our shade garden. What else? We have a
Ghost fern,
Yeah.
ferns.
Oh, we had, yeah. The good part about it
Lily
is
of the Valley.
on the shade, you can almost do anything that'll take shade or full shade. If you look at it, you look at a lot of hosta. Some of the hosta we had, they had the sun power, which went from the outside edge. And as you get deeper and deeper shade, you can use the blue, darker and bluer hostas as you go deeper. Like the cross of regal was a deep blue that goes into the back. And a combination of that with the ferns,
Oh,
with the
ferns.
ferns
Oh, love
and
ferns.
goat's beard, we had just a complete garden in the back, which was absolutely beautiful because of just the different shades and textures of green.
Yes, definitely work on the different textures of green.
There's a
I have
question.
two things. Go ahead.
Okay.
Ted.
Well, I was gonna go right down the line here. Someone said, Alice wanted to know about coneflowers getting Astor's yellows. Do you
Oh,
know-
you're talking about when it gets the growth out on the tip of it?
Yep.
Yep.
I can answer that one.
Go ahead, Tom.
Basically, it's
Gone.
not a virus. It's actually a phloem. It's not a bacteria. It's not a fungus. It's a whole different creature. And it's very close. It's close to a virus.
Yeah.
But really, there's no cure for it. You have to
Yank the plant out.
pull those plants out or live with it. Some people just live with them, but
Want to spread
it'll spread by, I think, by aphids. I think
Yes.
or
Yes.
our hoppers,
Leaf hoppers.
leaf hoppers.
it's a
Do you?
phloem. That's right. You're right. You're smarter. Yeah. But that's
Say that
exactly.
again. I didn't hear you, Tom.
Yeah. It's a kind of it's an organism that's halfway between a bacteria and a virus. It's that size. It's a whole different
Well,
thing.
the nice thing is that replacing a coneflower is not the same as having like with the knockout roses with the issues they have. It's not, it doesn't hurt you as much to replace a coneflower.
Okay, was it Howard that had a question or somebody?
I had two. I have
Bill.
not questions, but I have two things. Last year at the expo, Clyde Matthews told me, of course, Carol has hydrangeas. He put aluminum fleshing around his blue ones and they were almost purple.
Really?
And I've done that this year. Also, you're talking about labeling. I've got a Brothers labeling machine. And of course, you have to buy the tapes for it. It comes in different colors. And I make my labels with it and they'll last forever.
Oh, yes. We have those down at the Hummingbird and Butterfly Garden. But I was just, when I said popsicle sticks, I was just thinking something
Yeah,
quick
right.
and easy.
Yeah.
So you didn't lose your plant over the winter.
If you go down to the garden down there, there's a place in St. Louis that actually makes those. They're all made out of stainless steel. Those labels have been in there since the second year we put the garden in. So they've been there 15 years. There's not a speck of rust on them.
Oh, really?
And the labels stay on.
Yes.
Master
The
Garden.
labels haven't come off.
Mine is on aluminum label, aluminum stick with the label. I
Oh,
paste
yeah.
the label on that and they stay on like that.
They do. They stay very well.
Yeah, that works good.
Good information, Stephanie. Appreciate it.
Okay, what can you plant underneath pine trees?
Oh, man.
Well, Mike mentioned last night, and I think it's a great idea because you got to remember, anytime you plant under a tree, you're competing with the roots of the tree. So we found that lamb's ear worked fantastic. That like he said last night, it doesn't really bloom, but it's really a nice light green that lightens up the area. It makes a great ground cover.
But the other thing under the pine trees, which is really
Azaleas.
cool, azaleas, rhododendrons, you can really almost plant anything in the shade because a lot, especially the native plants, a lot of the natives absolutely love having the thick pine thickets and stuff that are under there. And if you ever look at, a lot of people will like pine needles under there. The soil, if you check the soil, it may be a little acidic. But what's really weird, people said, doesn't pine needles change the acidity? No, it doesn't. It takes a longer period of time than what you think to change that acidity. And so 90% of your shade plants will absolutely love it underneath the pine trees. The main thing you got to watch out for is, which Linda and Stephanie both brought up, is watch how the sun goes across. watch how much shade, full shade or partial shade that you get. That really makes a variety on what you do as far as your different plantings that you use underneath there. So look at your sunlight. That's more important than anything else. Now, that's not to say that the pH is not important, but the sunlight really plays a factor in what you really plant under there.
Well, your azaleas and hydrangeas like the early sun, afternoon shade.
And
Now,
Pam Bear said Lenten Rose. I mean, she must have
oh, Lenten
Yep,
Rose,
yep.
yes. You know, I didn't used to like Lenten Rose, but I've come to appreciate it now because you can get it in so many colors. And
Yeah.
you can't kill that. It's a
It
great.
spreads too. It actually drops
It's
seeds
great.
and it will spread.
Now, I would say if you're planting under a tree, I would go with a smaller plant so you're not disturbing the roots. Disturb those roots as little as possible.
We have a little story about the green ash that Tom saved in our backyard. I couldn't figure out because the roots actually are very shallow because the soil is very hard. So I was trying to figure out what to do. What was really unique, I took and put some smaller hostas up in there. You wouldn't believe how big they got in between and covered how the
roots that were
roots that come
exposed.
out, the ones that exposed, it covered it during the summer and absolutely made it look beautiful around the bottom.
Well, it took a couple years because we
Yeah.
planted teeny tiny hostas.
Yeah.
So we wouldn't disturb the root.
Right.
I'm not sure how this is the right. It says, what plant should I stay away from concerning bees? I'm not sure if they're trying to,
Oh, you don't want bees?
I'm not sure. Sharp, can you push your button? And,
Yeah, I have a granddaughter that's allergic to bees.
Oh,
And so I try to avoid when I'm planting, putting out things that bees are attracted to because of issues with that.
yeah.
I would say,
Full sun or partial shade or shade?
Listen, my yard is nothing but shade, so I have a problem there.
Well, the one good thing about it is it's not a real problem because you can use a lot of green leafy textures in your yard. Ferns, a lot of hostas, they only put up the little shoots from time to time early in the spring. And then after the bloom's gone, it looks absolutely beautiful. So the ferns are there and they'll cover the ground. There's one that's called a woodland fern that when you plant it, it acts as a mass and a ground cover that goes across the shade area and will come up, and the woodland fern makes a carpet in your backyard and your shade.
now the
Well,
problem is most,
I have tried ferns under the trees, but they seem to not do well. I don't know what they.
Typically, it's either a little of the condition or both. Make sure you got a lot of organics mixed in. The other thing too is on ferns, they do like it moist soil underneath there. So if it's a dry area or if you can't get water to it, sometimes that creates a problem too.
Okay, all right. Thank you very much for your help.
Okay.
Hey, there's a question that asked about pruning hydrangeas after blooming, and how do you say you get them to turn purple?
okay, how do you get them to turn purple? Or you get them to turn purple?
Well, pruning after bloom is probably a good suggestion.
Well, I would say unless you absolutely know that the hydrangea you have is one that blooms on old and new wood, like an endless summer does. And most of your paniculatas, the ones that are more cone shaped, like the limelight, they usually bloom on old and new wood as well. But if you want to be safe, just prune them after they bloom, and then
That's
just
what
cut
I-
off any wild growing, obviously you're going to have to cut off any wild growing branches because you're always going to get that as well.
And I know a little bit about purple hydrangeas. I know you can adjust it for blue and pink, but there's actually cultivars that are more prone to be both blue and pink, and
Right.
so you should pick the ones that are more prone to be that color. You can't always just rely on changing and using.
No, right. You're
Or,
correct.
There's one that McMinnville, they're real proud of, called Ruby Slippers.
Ooh.
They oak leaf hydrangea that's somewhat reddish purple. It's really a cool looking one,
Well, there are some that are just pink. They're going to stay pink no matter what.
right?
They've cultivated those as well. And usually a white one obviously is going to stay white, period.
How about oak leaf hydrangea? We talked about that a little bit. Yeah, oak leaf hydrangea, that one is new wood, right?
New and old wood, oak leaf.
Yeah. So prune it after it flowers.
I would. I mean, just to be safe. You'll get blooms on everything then, not just the new wood.
Yeah. That sounds good. Okay. Anybody else have any questions? I'll put up the poll. Let's do this poll. I'm going to stop the recording. Let's see.